Good evening, everyone. My name is Brenda Fassie, and I'm part of the team that runs the Forge and the Commune. Thank you all so much on this very cold Joburg night for coming out and helping us launch this wonderful book. Behind me, I have some incredible people, very smart, way smarter than me, because this book gives me nightmares. It's a beautiful book. It's such a wonderful way of writing and understanding, and Tumi has done an incredible thing here, but it's intellectually intimidating for some of us. So we got in the professionals to come in and talk to Tumi about his work. And I would like to introduce you to our moderators and our moderator and our discussant. Our moderator is Danai Mbotsa. She is a senior lecturer at the WITS Department of African Literature at WITS. She describes herself as a feminist teacher and researcher. In 2018, she published her debut collection of poetry, Feeling and Ugly, with Impepo Press. Her work specializes in a range of subjects that include gender and sexualities, black intellectual traditions and histories, intimacy and affect, pop culture and feminist pedagogies. And then our discussant. Dr. Atim Gamso holds an honors degree in political studies and international relations from the University of the Witwatersrand and a Master of Social Sciences in African Studies from the University of Oxford. Atin Gamso was an organizing member of Rhodes Must Fall movement in Oxford, the Fees Must Fall movement at Wits University, and Rhodes Must Fall UCT. She's an Oxford Weidenfeld Scholar and editor of Rhodes Must Fall, The Struggle to Decolonize the Racist Heart of Empire. She is currently an African Studies PhD candidate at UCT, where she worked as a lecturer in political studies until 2019. And then the man of the hour. So I had to ask Tumi because he sent me a very, very long bio. So I'm just going to, because Tumi is very accomplished at what he does. And he has been in the arts for a long time. But I think for a lot of people, this is the first time they're seeing you as an academic and in a public space, doing your public intellectual work so well. So tonight, we are launching this book here, DeAesthetic. Writing with and from the Black Sonic, which presents essays by Johannesburg artist and jazz percussionist and thinker Tumi Mogorosi. The essays focus on the Black Sonic as a dislocated episteme, which identifies the aesthetic as a limitation. In their decentering, the text fundamentally open a way to write and read beyond hegemonic knowledge validations. As a reading that straddles between Brenda Fassie, Louis Armstrong, Moholo-Moholo and Sade, they are in visual conversations with the symbols created by Emeka Alms of Gold Coast Trading Company. So with that, I hand over to you, Danai.
To me, who's going to start with her? Hello.
Hello. It's cool. So take it off.
Yes.
Hi everyone. Thank you guys for really coming out. I really appreciate it. So we thought maybe to sort of like to maybe read something from the book, and then get a set of reflections from Ati and Danai, and then maybe we can open it up for a Q&A on the floor. I was also hoping to sort of to play these songs, but I mean I think I'll just read the lyrics. But I think also the music plays an important role, just in a sense that there's a particular sort of like setting or position that the sonic itself sort of like presents, that when it's juxtaposed with the words, they really sort of like get to the discussion or to the argument. So the essay that I'm reading is Hearing at the Limit of the Audible, a Feeling, reading Sade and Ladysmith Black Mambazo, a sonic theorization of blackness. So what I'll do first is then I'll read the lyrics of Sade's song Jezebel. So Jezebel wasn't born with a silver spoon in her mouth. She probably had less than every one of us. But when she knew how to walk, she knew how to bring the house down. Can't blame her for her beauty. She wins with her hands down. Jezebel, what a belle. Looks like a princess in her new dress. And I'm also trying to think again, historically, the idea of Jezebel, I mean, biblically, Jezebel was sort of like the one who instituted the praise of Baal. And she was the wife of King Ahab, who was, I think, seventh dynasty Hebrew sort of like king, and from this sort of like the praise of Baal becomes attributed to sort of like Jezebel. And I mean, again, sort of like this foreign character that's always been sort of like ascribed to the character of the woman, right? So, and I'm also trying to think about this notion of Jezebel in sort of like everyday language. Kokasi, you know, whenever you get ascribed these sort of like names, it is a character more than sort of like a person. So it becomes sort of like a characteristic of people that become sort of like prescribed or sort of like overarched by this sort of like paradigm of activities that Jezebel sort of like is attributed to. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to get into it. Hey. So, I mean, the name and song Jezebel offers a devastating thesis. Thanks to Spillers, it opens up a way to think of the basis of a violent misnaming, of a female subjectivity that is incapable of owning its own body. And this is what Spillers calls sort of like captive bodies. Or the inverse, the use of the body through sexual indecency or immorality as an act of freedom in the New World context. And I'm trying to think about the New World context from Bernard Makubani, who sort of like locates South Africa within the paradigm of the New World. And also thinking about the Atlantic as a space sort of like, again, that preconditions the use of body. And I mean, slavery is also not always an economic thing, but in this instance, the Atlantic presents an economic sort of like extraction from the notion of the black, right? So more so, the title resonates with the lines in Hartman's paper, Saidiya Hartman's paper, in which she speaks of Venus. So the essay is called Venus in Two Acts, which she says. And I'm trying to think about Venus also, thinking about Sarah Batman, sort of like the Venus Hottentot, who was sort of like also sexualized and put in these sort of like sexual zoos to be sort of like gazed at, right? So I mean, there's always been this idea of an extraction when presented with sort of like the black female body, and then how sort of like this notion again of the Venus Hottentot is sort of like represented in these sort of like representations of Jezebel. And so Saidiya Hartman opens her essay, says, variously names Harriet, Phoebe, Sarah, Jonah, Rachel, Linda, Sally. She's found everywhere in the Atlantic world, in the barracoon, in the hollow of the slave ship, in the pest house, in the brothel, in the cage, in the surgeon's laboratory, in the prison, in the cane field, in the kitchen, in the master's bedroom. Turns out to be exactly the same place in all of them. She is called Venus. And I mean, we can also juxtapose this idea of Venus with sort of like, again, sort of like the idea of Jezebel. Now, there's a further misnaming, which is Jezebel, and unframing that Spillers has opened. This misnaming through the general power of naming that is preconditioned by the idea of ownership. So I mean, again, sort of like this notion of ownership that is preconditioned on a subjectivity that is able to own property. And so I mean, there's a distinction between property rights and sort of like, if one doesn't have these property rights, then one will be subject to sort of like the most excruciating of uses, right? So so this misnaming through a general power of not being able to name oneself is preconditioned by the idea of ownership. An illegibility of personhood, a person who's dispossessed of being. And I'm trying to think being again as this notion of a way of being in the world that is precondition of some kind of a metaphysics that was disrupted by again the encounter of the idea of being black, right? So the misnaming that happens to her as an act of refusal is this misrecognition as the very thing that makes one a woman. Or even to take a more radical stance, she claiming the monstrosity of refusing to be a woman. Claiming the Jezebel, claiming this misnaming, claiming this Jezebel character, a further misclaiming of a misnaming, the narrative that played out in the long rhythmic changes that establishes a melancholic and an absence versus a loss. So I'm trying to think about the music, the way it starts in a minor sort of like key. And this minor key always wants resolution, but in this particular song, it doesn't achieve this idea of resolution. So in sort of like music theory, whenever you get major and minor chords. So whenever you sort of like confronted with a minor chord, it always wants to resolve. But in this thing, there's a sort of like an incapacity of resolution. So it can't resolve because it needs to sort of like establish this sort of like dark and mystic. But as soon as you resolve it, it brings in sort of like a relief. So I mean, to sort of like maintain this tension, it revolves around this minor cadence. So this opening with misrecognition is the mode in which we ascertain sort of like a dialectic shortcoming, as they rely on recognition and the power to be recognized and incorporated into the aesthetic in forms of beauty. I mean, again, sort of like the aesthetic, thinking about it as the beautiful. Jezebel occupies a space outside of the beautiful because, again, she is indecent in all her activities, but then she's claiming this monstrosity, right? So how to sort of like reconcile this idea of claiming the monstrosity with the notion of sort of like gesturing towards a politics of respectability. So this is a question: Does the appearance of the female, when presented in blackness, put a crisis in the coordinates of femininity ascribed to whiteness, or does this gendering possibility collapse the appearance of the black? Does the collapse also allow for the misnaming or total disregard for being possible, for being a possibility of having a name or a dignity prior? This notion of also being black, of being blackened, is emphasized in her being born without a silver spoon in her mouth, as phrased by Sade. What shatters is the closed frame in which the human subjectivity is conditioned through so-called the moral and the ethical consideration. These morals and these ethics form the framework of a humanism based on the very process of othering. They make immoral and unethical beings possible, which by a consequence, which are consequently monitored by violence and gratuitous violence. And I mean, there's also sort of like this move of gratuitous violence and so gratuitous violence as a senseless kind of violence. That is, so I mean, in the song, Sade says that as soon as she learned how to walk, she learned how to bring the house down. And I mean, this idea of this senseless violence on an infant, this senseless violence that is conditioned on disregard of any form of subjectivity, whether it be child, infant, or the man. So I mean, there's this sort of like not even refusal, but incapacity to recognize the humanity that then ascribes all these belated sort of like categories of respectability. These unethical and immoral subjectivities are then assembled under the rubric of the whole Jezebel, Venus, Sapphire, or the gangster, Masevens, Java, Mremboli. These disfigured bodies and subjectivities becomes objects of pleasure and phobia. The female body appears as a symbol of sexual pleasure and satisfaction, while the black male body appears as the ground of threat, the quintessential Tsotsi, the Swart Khafar, responded to with violence to the point of death. Right? And I mean, I'm also trying to think about this, the first ontological instance of social death that sort of like is this idea of a general dishonor. And this is from the work of Orlando Patterson, who speaks about slavery and social death. But how this idea of being generally dishonored opens up ways of violence. and a general and I mean, I'm trying to think about, the Chinese will always have this thing about honor, like honor, like if you don't have money, you have honor, right? But then there's this sort of like general field of sort of like not being able to sort of like participate in the field of honor. So I mean, again, this opening up of the Nietzsche's eternal return of the violent, of the monstrous, as a way to operate in the world. And I mean this, and out of civil society, right? Thinking about the civil society as being civilized, like, So I mean, when you're presented by characters that are outside being civil, then they're sort of like met with this senseless violence that is not corrective. So the violence doesn't correct, but the violence sort of like maintains a distance to be able to recognize who's human and who's not. So now we return to Sade with her sonic theorization of a position that disrupts the dichotomy of patriarchy and feminism in the politics of respectability and incorporation. Viewed as existing outside the grasp of human subjectivity of rights, she reminds us of how the needs of Jezebel, she reminds us of the need for Jezebel's capture and her death, because as soon as she knew how to walk, she knew how to bring the house down. This presents us with such a critical and complex analysis in the wake of her existence in the house, which is a violation itself. The house of pleasure. Maybe the house can be the street, the whorehouse. As soon as Jezebel is able to walk, she will bring the house down by running from it or literally burning it down. This metaphor of walking, and again, I'm trying to think. And there's sort of like and a branch of sort of like legal philosophy talks about there's a moral law, and then the moral law becomes positive law. But there's a way that the moral law is tied into religious morality, and the way that sort of like Christian morality itself again sort of like inscribes all the way that one is due to act. And I mean, again, thinking about the sort of like religious morality and bringing it back again to Jezebel with being the wife of Ahab, who then sort of like brings about the prayer of the idols, Baal, right? It then sort of like comes full circle again to sort of like thinking about how these sort of like this order, right? This bringing of this order, and how this sort of like practice itself is a practice of bringing the house down. And how this practice of bringing the house down is again sort of like, inscribed in the metaphor of her walking. As soon as she knew how to walk, she knew how to bring the house down. So I mean, I think there's the movement and breath becomes important in the hermeneutic of an incomplete project of freedom, right? Because I mean, she doesn't get to freedom, and she doesn't want freedom. And this is the inverse of this idea of claiming the monstrosity, is that she doesn't want the sort of like the after. She's in the moment of bringing the house down, right? So I mean, I'm trying to think about this as a precondition of sort of like ending the world. But then again, this Afro-pessimist sort of like thesis of ending the world doesn't give us what happens after. But we need to linger in this moment before we can get to the after. Because before you can play the next note, you need to deal with this note first. So so I mean, in this moment, the irony, the irony about her beauty is that instead of it being a gift, it becomes her downfall. As she is preyed upon, her beauty becomes blackened, maybe a curse as something she can't be blamed for. And then this notion that she can't be blamed for her beauty, because again, this openness to be seen, it's a moment of hyper visibility, as opposed to a hyper invisibility. But the hyper visibility itself comes with unwanted touches, unwanted looks, unwanted. So I mean that there's all these things that her beauty, that she can't be blamed for her subjectivity, right? And how this collapses back again into then how she claims this monstrosity of being looked at and being touched in an improper way, right? So I mean, her beauty makes her prey for the desires of men, and at the same time, it enables her own dissidence of being a bad girl, a bad bitch. And I mean, I'm trying to think about this idea of bad girls. Yeah, and always growing up, my grandma would be like, "Hey, banyana wale, sawubona utsamaya ngwanyana ole," and you end up asking yourself like all these questions around notions of badness and what is the quintessential sort of like acceptable way of being in the world that is productive. I mean, there's a sort of like there's this thing about being productive, about progress, about an outcome based kind of a thing that so there's this thing that you have to make the right choice to be able to get the best outcome, right? So there's this thing that this othering that becomes the condition of progress, and it can happen in no other way. You can't let everyone in because there's this tainted, you get tainted by these characters. Like, you're not supposed to go to these places because you won't come out the same. You get, so again, trying to put the veil, right? And I mean, and I'm trying to think about what is on the other side of the veil. That's always trying to be covered. So what is this thing that is behind the veil? That is always sort of like people don't. You don't want people to see this thing that is behind the curtain, and this act of this thing that is behind the curtain is all this putting up a good act, putting up a good front, and like we were speaking outside, just like getting more degrees, getting more accolades, getting as a way to not fall back into the abyss that can happen at one go. With all you can build for 100 years and it can collapse in one moment, right? And this is always the possibility of blackness to fall right into the abyss, and I mean again, so when asked how she got her dress, it becomes important for us to notice that it's how and not where. And I mean this notion of like, how did you get your dress, not where did you get your dress. It's just like, because I know there's a particular incapacity that you can't have this kinds of things. So how did you get them? And I mean, this is an impossible question to ask, because if she tells you how she got it, you wouldn't want to, it's just like then, because of this impossible question, she answers by giving a terrible possibility in the wake of being a marked body, a nobody against the state, like De Silva would say. The impossible, terrible answer made possible by such a question will be too much for the question and questionnaire to bear. It is outside the realm of possible acceptable answers. This is the means that the rubric under which such a questioning takes place has some structural impossibility that is fraught with incapacities to hold what it is asking for. It's just like there's a refusal for the answer to register when it's given, and so you ask yourself, how do these questions come up? If we answer the question, the answer doesn't register, right? So I mean, again, there's this sort of like notion of Heidegger speaks about Dasein as this ability to grasp, So Dasein comes into the world with the capacity to grasp. But what happens when Dasein faces a moment of an inability to grasp that which is presented? And I mean, I think this is the moment that this idea of crowding out, Afro-pessimism has this notion of crowding out, that we need to crowd out these impossible answers so we can focus on moments and events as opposed to the paradigm or the structure that allows for the moments and events to be possible. So I mean, for example, people say, okay, now post 94, and then as an event, and forget the structural capacity that allows for the ruse of such an analogy of a post, right? But then there's a way to mark the moment as an event outside of the long historical accumulation that becomes part of this, neoliberal handover. So again, there's a structural impossibility. The structural impossibility is made possible by what Hartman says. There's a convergence of terror and pleasure in the libidinal economy. And I mean, thinking about Jezebel, there's been legislation on sexual behavior, and the idea of sort of like the libidinal economy as this idea of sexual desire. And then you think again, the public versus the private. This legislation of sort of like a sexual behavior had permitted that soliciting on the street is the crime. So the people who have no space to sort of like have respectable sort of sex work as opposed to prostitution is conditioned by this notion of again the private versus the public. And how to think about this notion of the private and the public when confronting the notion of blackness always becomes a murky space of what is private and what is public. Given where we come from, you could hear the next door neighbor, So there was never really a moment of privacy. Like everybody knows everybody's ditabata everybody. So I mean this notion of privacy, but then again you are here in the new world where there's a demarcation of privacy and public, and law with its punitive sort of like a response is conditioned on this notion of private and public. And then you think again of this idea of public and private with the notion of property and the idea of ownership of property. And the idea of the black majority who own no space, who own no land, and how then the sort of like there's a fallacy of trying to demarcate the notion of private and public. So it means that from the onset, the practice will be an illicit practice, and they will be arrested. So there is no way to sort of like have a governed space of proper exercise of sexual freedom, or there's this notion of a collapse of a gesturing towards a politics of a possible subjectivity that can hold its own body and being, right? So, I mean, I was going to read this whole thing, but I don't think also, I do this. I don't know. Maybe I'll read the one from Black Mambazo a bit, and then maybe like also just then start having a conversation. So like in this essay also I'm also focusing on Ladysmith Black Mambazo with the song Homeless, and I'm trying to also use homeless as a framework to again point to the notion of natal alienation, but also the collapse of an idea of home, and what home might mean. So I mean the song first the song starts with homeless. It doesn't start with anything else but that. So it doesn't give like Frank will say there is no narrative arc that begins with there's home and then we are homeless, but it starts with being homeless. So so there's a radical and not out of agency, but there's a radical unowning of ideas as it displays. I think of how black studies can echo across time and space, and so it all belongs to those who don't belong. Wilderson's lack of narrative arc, lack of point of plentitude to depart from, then becomes a script out of Mambazo's songbook. This beginning with natal alienation, the sonic theorization that becomes ours in the plight of blackness, in an anti-black world, and in South Africa to be particular. Mambazo's lament of homelessness in the reading is juxtaposed by Blackie's native life in South Africa. Yeah. Where am I? That marks yet another vivid moment of the re-inscription of being black in the world. Blackie opens up with the same catastrophe as Mambazo. As they've already sort of offered us a devastating at the level of the title. And he speaks and he opens up with a sentence saying, awakening Friday morning, June 20th, in South Africa, the native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in his land. And I mean, the contention that I was speaking with Ati earlier on about this thing, not to preempt this thing.
Gena.
Okay, no, I'll just read, and then we'll get back to this moment. Mambazo being predominantly Istratamia male vocal group is again an interesting way to see how maleness doesn't signify the privilege of its assumptive logic within the capacity of the new world. By the incapacity to occupy this position of maleness provides an insight on being outside the human coordinates. Mambazo's refrain of homeless is a natal alienation thesis that opens up the collapse of a geographical divide with the rest of the new world. And I mean, I'm trying to think about, again, this notion of a general dishonor of being homeless. I mean, there's a certain sense of dishonor that comes with not being able to have a home. And I mean, we know we're faced with this on a day-to-day basis, sort of like the lack of decency that homelessness presents, right? And again, not to use the sort of like moralistic lens of again, sort of like the legal moralism or the Christian morality of sort of like, again, ascribing to this special place of home, right? But this notion of sort of like now finding yourself in this notion of articulating a space of non-being. Okay. This notion of not belonging becomes violently clear from 1652 onwards regarding black life in South Africa. This point I want to focus on, though, is much later in the timeline with all its accumulated history of violence. If, again, we take seriously the claim that blackness collapses time and space, then we see how this following analysis still holds in its failing to hold as a periodical reading, right? So I mean, again, this idea of sort of like thinking about the period of 1913 as the moment of the Land Act, as this moment of re-inscription of blackness, becomes fails to hold in this notion of the periodical, right? Because again, it re-inscribes the history that is not really history, the history that then finds another way of being, that finds another way of expressing itself in its sort of like anti-black logic of wanting to extract, right? Periodical reading, sharp. Sharp. Okay, so we are looking at 1913 according to Blackie as a moment of the terrible return of anti-blackness that never left, yet returns in another way in forms of systems of ownership that is enacted on black bodies. The introduction of the Native Land Act was not only demarcated to the land according to color line, but also forbade land ownership according to it. And I'm thinking about this idea. Cheryl Harris has this essay called "Whiteness as Property," and this notion of inheritance as ascribed to the notion of whiteness, and mainly the surname and the patriarch. So again, this idea of whiteness as property opens up the idea of the legal, right, and the subject and the sovereign, and the one who's recognized by legal theory and by jurisprudence as it stands. So I mean, again, this notion of a general homelessness speaks again to this notion of a lack of property right, and how does one sort of like then without these essential coordinates of what being a human is in the world, which is property, rights, and all these things, how does one then ascribe themselves as human if one is outside of the coordinates of these assumed or presupposed qualities of what it means to be a subject in the civil sense. Yeah. So this act or non-act requires from the Kafirs an incapacity to own land. It was a result of the consequences of the black existence, and so it becomes a pedagogical moment of how of how the reinscription of power is a structural necessity. And I mean, again, going back to the idea of a structural analysis as opposed to a event analysis, or sort of like a period analysis, periodic analysis. It goes back to this notion of then not looking at the performance, and again going back to the music itself, the music can't. I'm trying to think again of sort of like sort of all the music that were presuppositions of liberation music. That this idea of the presupposition of sort of like the liberatory tool itself doesn't stand outside of a contaminated space of blackness. That it already comes inscribed with the moment of blackness. So it doesn't exist outside of a moment of outside a moment of that structural necessity, that structural requirement that is inescapable within the coordinates of this world that we know. And I mean, it's also very important to speak about the world in its conceptual framework as opposed to the earth. We think about the world as a way of being in the world, right? Not the earth itself, but the world as a conceptual frame of acceptable ways of navigating the space, acceptable ways that allow for people to recognize. So as soon as you are presented with misrecognition, it's then these ways that are outside of the coordinates of what is acceptable within the world. And I mean, again, this is this is an ontological question, right, versus an existential question, right? So we're not talking the lived experience. It is late. This is a belated sort of like refusal of the first ontological instance or the first moment of conceptualization, right? Of conceptualization. So again, and also really thinking about music really offers a way to think about this as this. You know, the marketplace killed this for us because now you have a CD. But first, if you heard a song and the song disappeared, right? But now you have this way of playing the song. So I mean, there's this real sort of like way of thinking about this ontological outside of being able to grasp then what becomes the object. So I mean, again, this book is also and these essays are really sort of like ontological questions as opposed to existential questions or phenomenology. Um, okay, I think this is important. So these devastating accounts exist as such as those of burials at night on the road, leaving no trace or tomb in remembrance of the deceased, leaving no human trace due to having no official land for proper burial, leaving only the side of the road as a place where the deceased can be covered up. And I mean, this is a moment in Blakey's account of the dispossessed, when there was a sick child and the child died in the wandering, and they only had the side for burial, and you also needed to make it seem like there was no burial at all. So I mean, these sort of like symbolic notions of how humans buried, sort of like a sign of remembrance, were not offered to sort of like these landless blacks who were sort of like dispossessed in 1930. So I mean, again, these sort of like coordinates of humanity or of humanism that allows one the symbolic were not availed for these landless black pariahs. And this is what, you know, Hartman might call the afterlife of slavery, and what it offers us in its unfolding. So I think I'll just read one more page and open it up. Mambazo's homelessness already is always, in other words, one that does not become homeless. One who's always already is homeless. Being homeless, dispossessed, is an idea and a practice. Being homeless, dispossessed of the idea and the practice of home is a condition of blackness. We can say that Mambazo, if we were to think of him as a character, would be along the lines of an homelessness being preconditioned by his blackness, which occludes him on sight. And I mean, this idea of occluding people on sight goes back to Fanon's over-determinateness from without. This idea that once by presenting the black body, it already unveils this ontological non-density, right? Like the appearance of black comes with a presupposition, an assumed sort of like logic of no ontological density. And then there comes the act of proving that one has the ontological density, right? As a performance again of recognition within the world. Yeah. Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
Awesome. For me, the set of essays, I'm curious about the Plaiki Mambazo debate. So don't let me forget it. Just flag it. For me, what's the form of the essay and a lot of the form of your writing and what it enables narratively. So you are able to argue so in many ways, the argument that you present is narratively constructed by the very form of how you write. By not only just the use of these kind of short essays, but also so that you don't. In this one, I'm going to do this one and then conclude with this one. And at the end, everyone will be happy. You know, that kind of the sort of narrative structure of what writing often looks like. So I think that there's something really, there was a discussion about your diction being incredible. If a person has a dictionary, but the diction is incredible. But the structure of your writing is quite remarkable in the sense that it does this narrative account or narrative performance of the argument itself. The preface itself I was like, this is how a person should write an introduction, because it does this way. I'm so kind. It's posthumous kindness. Everyone is great now. No, but it's like, no, but there is a way that grasping that you describe, or the way that you bring a dialectic into the space. So it's sovereign and freedom, but it's not unfreedom and non-sovereign that you seek for. And so that there's something about, from the beginning, this this grasping that becomes a method, that becomes both a method of how you read the range of text you're engaging, but also present a set of arguments. I think it's interesting that you begin with language. Because I was like, well, why not culture and a kind of Hegelian culture? You start with Heidegger and language, and I was like, and I wondered, and I guess when you conclude by saying ethnographically, this is not what I'm, then I'm like, oh, maybe this is the nice little personal interest in why I end up there, because I was sitting there thinking of in the narrative of Equiano, who speaks many languages and has many names, but how he loses his language and enters the kind of ontological status of the black or the slave. Is this in the water? It's language. It's the and then this language, and it's gone. So I was like, oh, maybe this is where you begin to begin with dislocation, and then to enter into homelessness, and then to begin a range of a set of questions across the book that I think you're stuck in this grasping that I think is answering a lot of interesting questions. So that's just my main impression was just like, oh, this is really beautiful, but I really want to know about Taiki and Mambazo. I'm very curious.
Yeah, so I wanna pick up off. Can everybody? Yeah, off of what you're saying about the way that Tumi writes this book, and I'm like incredibly jealous because it's no small thing to choose to write something like this and use the narrative as a way of insisting the argument, as opposed to what we're being made to have to do in this kind of like social science-y obsessed form of writing, and way of doing argumentation. And it's just not fair that he was able to publish this book. I'm mad about it. I'm jealous because I like in my thesis I was doing something where I thought the form is part of the methodology of this, like, not even refusal. I think refusal follows a kind of solicitation that is recognizable, and then you can say no. But when you can never say no, I don't know what you can refuse. You know what I'm saying? So it's refusing the form in order to, not refusing that's not the word I mean, right? I mean the other thing that I was saying is just now, like not having the form, because the form insists that you make a thesis and then you provide evidence, that you prove that. And my thing is like, why the fuck would I have to prove a paradigm? Do you know what I'm saying? Which the literature you're using, someone like Patterson, has already done back-breaking, like social sciences work with an army. And I hear Patterson with like an army of like 100 researchers or something like this from Harvard, in order to research the slave, and then to come about what is the most, I think, vivifying aspect of his study. Studying slavery in the Far East, in the Middle East, all throughout the world, and then coming to this thing, which I think is the most interesting and brings me to Blackie, that slavery is not a condition of existentialism, of being actually a slave, the way that Blackie puts it. It's a structuring condition. And so whether you pick up a pig, or you're shackled, or you're wearing, the quintessential hand-me-downs as opposed to the master's suit, your lived experience may have changed in your own eyes, in the impression of what is preconsciously your own identity, the things you are capable of asserting about and for yourself. But your condition under the paradigm hasn't been broken. And so the paradigm just morphs to find a way to reinstantiate your condition. Because as soon as something is the condition of a paradigm, it is necessary. So that violence isn't gratuitous and senseless for no reason. It is necessary in order to inculcate ideas about what kind of violence is accepted, what measure of violence is justifiable, against a violence which is too terrible to understand. Do you know what I'm saying? So coming to this Blackie thing, one of the other things that makes me really frustrated with what Tumi is allowed to do, which I think we should all be allowed to do, is that, you know, if I am trying to talk about, if I'm asserting, insisting the way that Tumi's book provokes, that the Black is locked in a condition of non-being. This doesn't mean they aren't like a sentient being, that they aren't here, you aren't looking at them, they don't have sensations. It just means that in the symbolic register of what it means to have like this density. So the kind of thing that the law responds to, for example, these are your dues. Why? Not because you are a sentient being with sensations. Dogs have flesh and sensation, but they don't have dues, which are inalienable, which are locked up in themselves as a matter of being an ontological, dense being. Do you know what I'm saying? So if I'm trying to, if I start with that thesis and I'm saying that the Black is a non-being, it feels in my kind of like evidence training through the university and even school, you know, that to bring Blackie up and to bring this particular line is counterintuitive to what I'm trying to say. If I wanted to deal with Blackie, whose first line is, the Black is not actually a slave, you know, when your thesis is that the Black is a slave, I would come at Blackie in an argumentative way, and not in a way that opens up my thesis, in order to say, you know, Blackie observes this.
But he fails.
But he fails. But you don't have to prove that. You know what I'm saying? Because you're just writing in this way, in this form. It's just dope as fuck. I'm just mad that I don't get to do it. You know what I'm saying? But otherwise, like, so I was like, why is Tumi doing this? Why would he start with Blackie Apa actually? Because we were busy talking about Ladysmith. You know what I'm saying? And what they are saying about homelessness. But I think it's brilliant because when we're talking about home and we're thinking about this song, the way we've always thought about the song, and I'm like a big Ladysmith Black Mambazo fan, like Ubab Shabalala's my first crush, my parents loved him, I have vinyls, that whole thing. So I know all the songs, I know the moves, and I know the feeling, I know the spirit of the song, right? And the spirit of a song like Homeless, when they're performing, I don't know, in Paris, in London, it feels like one of those things where you like collect a couple of Blacks and you're like, y'all look authentic, let's take you to, you know, somewhere, and then you can tell them about, you know, how fucked up shit is in South Africa, and they can feel like, oh man, they should be doing this to these Blacks. Let's do a Bono concert, and just be like, nah, don't do Blacks like this. The world stands with Blacks. You know what I'm saying? And yet, you know, the condition doesn't change in South Africa, and the whites you came to are psychically rejuvenated because they're like, but those whites in South Africa. Now, we're better, and we gave these hungry Blacks a place, you know. Look at them, they're homeless. You know what I'm saying? But you bring in, when you're talking about that, you bring in the question of the slave to in the same moment contemplate home and homelessness. And this is where like you do Blackie dirty, because he fails. Because what he's actually seeking is a plot of land and a home, like a place that you can bury a child, mark with generations of, I don't know, body of flesh, bones, in order to be able to recover home with those markings that are symbolically a reflection of your dues, right? But the crisis for Blackie is, you know, like you were saying, the New World proposes something else for him. And in fact, he gives us evidence of slavery that song singing, you know, Song of the Pig type of artistic image and memory, right? Which in South African consciousness is just not there. We think we're colonial subjects. Van Riebeeck came, we fought a little bit, and then we were conquered and we became subordinates, subhumans, less than human in relation to these whites. But not a history of slavery, the matter of slavery as a process, which is not colonialism, like colonialism in India or Malaysia or South America, but a process of creating a paradigm under which black and slave would mean the exact same thing, not because slavery means chains or a pig, but it is a condition for how it is you can world, right? How you, like you were saying at the beginning, how you maneuver. And I was like, oh man, what a dope way to use someone that's always being used against this idea of like, one, the fact of actual slavery all throughout South Africa, the slave raid of the Voortrekkers all the way to Sekhukhune land in the Eastern Cape, in the Western, all over the place, right? But two, what a way to think then, to kind of like propose a thinking which is undoable, like these questions that we're supposed to ask, which are impossible to respond to because we're just not prepared to sit with them. We're always asked to provide a solution, right? If you say we're dead, then what? Then what, Nyan?
Yeah.
If we don't have investment in the things of living, then what? Yeah. And I think those implications are really, really interesting and provocative. But the fact of bringing like slavery in and then thinking it through Spillers, thinking it through Patterson, is about like saying more than we went from one thing to another thing and we're climbing along a trajectory of progress, but that in fact we are a condition for the production of what is world, what is music, what is art, what is human being. Because in order for all of those things to be knowable, legible, they need something against which they can know themselves to not be. And that is the slave, not a person in shackles, but a person whose structuring condition is natal alienation, the severing of ties of birth in descending and ascending order. So not that just I don't know my grandmother, but my relation with my grandmother or my daughter's daughter is of no consequence in the world, and I cannot seal it off in these ways which are imagined under a structure of a family filiality, which brings about a home, protection, and seals you off as an entity unto yourself. You know what I'm saying? It's like a basis, a foundation for what we will come to know as the state and then the world, not the earth, but a system of, an organized system of human maneuvers. And then, secondly, gratuitous violence, senseless, without cause. The blacks was shot because they were there, not because he was selling cigarettes or he was eating kota in his shack. He was there, and blacks and deathliness must continue to happen. It's not like genocide, we wipe them out, but they must continue to die, and they must be expressed as dying, about to die, can die. Might have, the DeAesthetic book and a PhD from Harvard, but if it's dying time, it's dying time. It's dying time anytime. And we don't have, and there's no recourse. There's no need to explain it. It's just a way that everybody can be like, oh shit, it's bad, but I'm not black.
She was such a good. She was so good.
She was so good.
Yeah.
And then we'll move on. There's another good black. You know what I'm saying? And the prompt is not like, let's end that condition of possibility. No, the prompt is just that, this is a bad thing. We must always know this is a bad thing, and it cannot happen to us. It must always be a violence we cannot imagine from the distance of human and slave. And then, thirdly, this condition of general dishonor. So I think what is most interesting about Patterson's general dishonor that you bring out in this homeless, in the use of homeless and Ladysmith Black Mambazo, is that if you can't have honor, how can you have community? And the slave symbolizes the expulsion of the black from world community. And so this grief that we have about home, this grief that we have about a collapsed narrative arc of like plentitude, of diaspora, of a lost place from which we come isn't a real thought enterprise in the world as it matters, because the world is only as it matters because the black is expelled from it. And so as soon as the black approaches the world and the world things, then the world disintegrates. It's kind of like that notion of once ungena kosa sport, you can never, it's never going to be the same, you know what I'm saying? And I think that like Jezebel just puts like a nice spice to reading this entire set of conditions and its overarching structure as a hermeneutic, because biblical kind of theological language and work allows us that space where consequence is not the immediate charge for thinking anything, but the principle, the paradigm is the most crucial thing. And this is how Jezebel is constructed, through fornication in the temples of Baal, and bringing dishonor to a big, legendary home, and therefore deserving of expulsion. But this Jezebel is the Jezebel on site at birth. There need not be any reason there need not be any transgression. The dishonor is general. You don't go through this process of like contravening and then being punished or meeting consequence. Death is the consequence, right? That's dope, man, and I'm touched.
You're touched. Was it? I appreciated that very much. Also, because I was like, what would you say for Blackie? What I'm interested in Blackie in terms.
You said it right. You were like Blackie.
No, I'm obsessed with Blackie in a weird way that was ready for it. In a different, also because it's interest in orthography and in putting things in language. There's interest in things in general, and it's interest in historical time, which is I'm interested in you maybe, because for people who haven't read the book, to think through how you engage with historical time as a territory, because I think Blackie's interest in historical time and why he rewrites native life the way he does I think that his interest is a recognition of the failure of historical time already. So there's a future looking failure that's already, but there's also like where am I going to go? My family doesn't like me. That's kind of what's going on. I'm like I'm stuck here in the UK doing Mambazo. He was also doing the petition thing. He's also done, there's a kind of deep similarity, but also what's interesting for him is he's also prior to South Africa's national time, in terms of his thinking. And I think that's also a lot of our limitation in terms of the way that national time, because we're so contaminated in the eventness of national time and those independences, then actually the connections between the homelessness across at least our territory in Southern Africa, I don't know the others. I know the others, but I'm saying at least then we can't actually, like, I would say to myself, because I know myself, 4 generations of my family I can't trace properly, right? But there is a sense that there's a sense of having to construct a sense of honor or a sense of respect. How I was first trained as a researcher was because someone kept calling me a Jezebel for drinking Black Label. So I was like, did my honors on respectability, because I'm like, why am I being called a Jezebel for drinking Black Label? Right? And so then that's how I'm trained to gather evidence. And I think there's something about his use of evidence, or his learning how to use evidence to think through that, I don't know if he even imagined South Africa, and then it happened. And then the national time of it happened, and then the kind of linguistic, those linguistic orthographies which become culture equals. So language becomes culture, becomes honor, right? And then we have this and then the customary becomes a space of honor. That's the space outside of blackness. Because if I think even my own father, he won't say I'm black, he'll say I'm an African. Mm-hmm. And then culture becomes a space of articulating honor, because it becomes a space outside of colonial framing and time. And so he was sitting in that moment, and he was doing all of those things, and he's just like, So there's something that I think, and which is why I thought it was so interesting you begin with this question of this language, and then this contained in the unfreedom of this national time, because I don't know if we know any other way to think of ourselves because of that event.
Yeah. And I mean, just before I think we open, just for me, this idea of language again, going back to sort of like psychoanalysis, right? So Lacan presents the mirror image that the moment of alienation is the moment when the symbolic comes into being. So the moment you the moment you feel something, critical distance, they call it in the academy, that critical distance is a way for you to articulate something, but being within something, right? This doesn't allow for you clear objective, right? So I mean, again, this idea of using language and also of the sort of like the symptomatic reading of what Blake is saying, right? Not yet a slave. How does he say this? What are these things that he can't say, right? And it's just like, again, you know, I'm always thinking about the Black Sonic as like when you're speaking to a hostage, you're always looking for signs. You're not taking what they're saying, right? You're always looking for these symptoms to tell you that, you know, what is the situation of your proximity to death, right? So I mean, so at all instances, at all encounters of black episteme, whether it be sort of like literature or there's always this lens of reading what is not said, and in music, Miles Davis said the silence is what makes the music, right? So and you think about silence and breath, right? That only at the moment of silence can one like literally on the trumpet, breath comes at that moment of silence. You're taking a breath when there's no note coming out. So I mean, those sort of like, again, real sort of like pedagogical moves that open up a way to sort of like read beyond the performative, to go beyond the event, to see beyond what is being presented to you, becomes a lens of sort of like really trying to think through what is impossible to be captured as some kind of a cultural production, as some kind of a cultural knowledge, you know, IKS or whatever.
So let me, I want you to flesh this out a little bit for me, because it's left as a kind of like note, not for resolution maybe, but for a little bit of exploration, particularly in this chapter, and it doesn't ring the same way in the rest of the book, because if you think about Lacan and the symbolic, and you think about where the moment of meaning happens, it's not necessarily in the performance, right? It's in what the performance itself symbolizes, its signifier, right? And not necessarily the performance. It's just the way that we're capable of knowing things, right? So I know that if she smiles, it's not the smile that's the most important thing. And it's not that I can't see the smile, it's that it is invisible, but I'm actually accessing something else which a smile communicates in this like signified relationship. Why the choice of thinking about breaching the audible when in fact it's not what it is that is heard, but what that communicates, what the grammar, kind of like the cartography I have of navigating what I hear, when that is kind of the crisis you amplify as the problem of the black. Yeah. The fact of like having no grammar with which to stabilize an expression. Yeah. The same kind of thing you're talking about of not having a language because you don't have critical distance. And with critical distance, you have coordinates, which you can use to read, you know, the analysant or the interrogated or whoever the subject you are analyzing from a distance. But if you are in what like Saxon calls the crisis of trying to describe the wetness of water while submerged in it, why does it matter the feeling of the wetness and not what it is, what its signifier is? So why the audible and not kind of like the incommunicable, despite audibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think, that's not an answer too. This is also trying to think really with what you're saying, because I mean, I think you're really presenting ways to sort of like further think. And I mean this. I mean, there was always this notion of sort of like breaking the sound barrier, but breaking the sound barrier, so and then sort of like this sound barrier, you juxtapose it with the sort of like there's a book in psychoanalysis called The Primordial Scream, that in the room of analysis, the moment of breakthrough is the moment of uncontrollable screams and crying. And if you don't reach this moment of the uncontrollable, then you haven't fully sort of like. But then there's this notion of sort of like when the black reaches that moment of the cry, the world doesn't recognize. So I mean, again, so sort of like at the limit of the audible, right? And as soon as you reach that moment of the primordial scream, it breaks the sound barrier and becomes silence. So I mean, there's this sort of like, again, sort of like parameters of sound that we hear only at a certain sort of like decibel range. But the moment things get higher, the frequency, our ears can't hear that, right? So there's a way that there's a crowding out, again, that happens at the moment of enunciation. And I mean, there's a guy called, I just forgot his first name, but Y, he's W-A-I, his last name, who writes about Mudimbe. And then he's writing about, is there a way for Africa to speak outside of a contaminated enunciation, right? As soon as you sort of like enunciate the moment of Africa, is there a way to speak about it outside of its contamination? So I mean, again, and what is these sort of like there's this notion of the fall, right? Of you know, there's a book on can't believe I forgot now, on Louis Armstrong, speaking about the scat. So they say the scat begins with the fall, right? So this senselessness, right? This and Clark Terry has a song called The Mumbles. So the scatting, this mumbling, this incoherence that I'm hearing but not understanding, is like it's again the sort of like notion of sort of like the music is trying to put into coherence something that doesn't make coherent sense, you know, and it also, not only that, it is an incapacity for it. I mean, it folds in on itself. It folds in on its assumptive logic of being able to describe a moment. It fails to describe the moment it is describing. But in that moment of enunciation, in that moment of contamination, that contaminated enunciation, it professes to be part of a liberation tool. But it fails. And I think this moment of failure, again, is this moment of inaudibility, right? This moment of sort of like, again, a collapse of the very coordinates of what is presupposed by this enunciation. That I will be in the space of being recognized for what I'm saying, and then what I say that is being recognized can then be incorporated into the system to adjust the system. So I mean, all these moments of trying to reform the system becomes again at the detriment of us, right? Yeah. So I mean, again, so it's this impossibility that is faced by the Black Sonic that you know, I think this book and it's trying to speak about, in terms of the failure of the practice of jazz music in its assumption logic of liberation. That it's been incorporated within commodity spectrum, and it's been the tool again of sort of like creating a bourgeois aesthetic of a middle class sensibility that then has this high art, low art division, and, you know, black, white, sort of, you know, again, sort of like these things that were presupposed as we've dealt with these things that are always sort of like returning.
Yeah, and for people who are just getting to touch the book now, to say something about the title and the DeAesthetic, because you theorize, you work through it in the first three chapters, but to say what it's also hermeneutic for you, which means there is also an anticipatory for you. If it's a hermeneutic praxis to use it, there is also an anticipatory gesture for the book, but along with sort of being like, well, that's terrible.
No, I mean, I think,
That was nice.
I think this idea of sort of like writing under erasure, like writing with scratching something out. I mean, Derrida does this, Foucault has done this. Of course, this is like critical theory, like Warren has done this, I mean, Hartman has done this, Moten has done this. It really points to working with incomplete. Yeah. This thing is incomplete, so I'm going to say black man, but I'm gonna scratch it out. But it's a but I don't you know what I mean. I don't mean, but it's just like it doesn't work because I don't fit the coordinates of what is presupposed by hearing this. But as a way that the world has ascribed identity, recognition. When you fill in a form, the self, and some kind of integrity, coherence for yourself. And I mean, if Mario says, I mean, raising jobs, what do you do with an unconscious that seems to hate you? So at every moment, if your unconscious seems to hate you, these moments of trying to ascribe yourself into respectability is a way of therapy, is a way of I mean, claiming the monstrosity is an act that not many people can do. So I mean, there's always this moment again, Afro-pessimism, Black Ops, of trying to flight into, fugitivity, into some. But then we presented with that moment, fugitivity is not freedom. And Sexton says fugitivity is not freedom. So how do we reconcile with the moment that we are not free? You might be running you might not be in the plantation, you might be running, but as soon as they catch you, you're going back. So you are not free, right? So how do you reconcile with the moment of not being free, right? Of this incomplete program of that we. So I mean, again, the DeAesthetic again is this. It's an incomplete. I mean, the Black Sonic is an incomplete sort of like project, right? It doesn't fit the aesthetics, and it's not a refusal of the aesthetics in its sort of like coordinates within the human. Polarizing respectability of identity, but then it's also not. It's not a name of a thing, right? You know what I mean. It doesn't signify a practice. You know what I mean? I'm using an Afro-pessimistic lens to read songs that have been written. You know what I mean? So these frameworks have been written. Have been sort of like, it's not like Afro-pessimism has been existing in these songs. It's just that I'm using a lens to be able to recognize these things, right? But so again, it's DeAesthetic is not a practice, but it's this momentarily like a preliminary analysis of how I'm thinking the Black Sonic. You know what I mean? And I don't know how else to.
I think we should soon go to the questions, but I have a question for both of you that starts with something you say, and it comes from also what you're talking about the social sciences and Black studies in general being having necessarily being interdisciplinary and allowing for these because there's no discipline that you can it doesn't make sense to be in any discipline, to be fair. And so there's this cross-disciplinarity, but we're also being evidence trained in all these ways. I was thinking also when you talk about biographies and how we have to sanitize, you're not going to be like, in 2003, I was. So we have these weird biographies that sanitize our existence, and then we become these fancy people who look a bit shiny. And so that's also then how we, part of the process of recognition and engaging in this way, but it's also connected to these questions of discipline. And so part of what you are working with around Black performance gives you access to, so there's lots of ways you enter different disciplines and you're like dead. So there's a way that which is sometimes necessary because you got to clean up crowd, you're cleaning up the crowd, but we're also, there's something I think also about, and this is where you talk about the poetic. So I think across our disciplines, there is something in terms of that is also a part of language, a part of what's not translatable across what we, so there is something that for me is oral, is sensed in the world, it's feeling, but it's also that may not be about the forms of recognition, because there's no recognition. You know, you can do all the things you want, and then you'll be the one black person who everybody quotes, but no one understands, who we know, you know. and then the minute you say something about them badly, then they're like, we're ready to be right. You know, or not just that, but also that, you know, the same people only reference that one person, that one black person, who immediately become racist to that person the minute you mention that you're not that person's protege or interest in them, because that's how it operates, because that's how the recognition works. And yet there is a way of having, but there seems to me a method of writing, but a method also of communicating, and maybe it's located in that use of I don't want to just then, because we go to opacity, then we're like, oh, we're also opaque. That's not what I mean. But I mean that there are these conversations, even when you talk about scatting, that maybe there's a collapse because it's a form of culture that's got this liberatory anticipation. But there's more also that's about communicating with other black people. That for me becomes a realm of another kind of, maybe this throws me into the Moten bunch, and this is what but it goes into another kind. So I'm interested from both of you in terms of, because we're talking in these sets of languages that are always, there's a, you know, you're in and outside of it constantly, but that what it produces is a set of language that is completely broken. And in the first place, like if I can be like, I'm going to be in psychoanalysis, and then now I'm going to be talking with history, now I'm in geography, but I'm actually right, and we're constantly shifting these positions. There is no coherence, but there's someone, but I understand what you're saying. But it's not that I understand you, because then I can conquer you. Right. Or that I can now translate you and then say, Ati said this, and this is what I'm translating you to mean, which is also the other use of evidence. I listen to you, and then I explain what you said.
Yeah, right.
Right? So that's not what, so what do we call that? How do we engage that aspect of work in this frame of conversation?
I think it makes things, it's taken me a minute, but it's clear to me, if my unconscious hates me, then my unconscious hates you. And even if we huddle, you know, like Morton's de Beauvoirian huddle, or Hudson's or Hartman's outside, or properly what I think Spillers is talking about when she talks about the black intramural, our business, bengekho abayana. If my unconscious hates me, my unconscious hates you. Why does my unconscious hate me? And that's the question. If we can understand the structure that positions me to hate myself, then our concept of black love and solidarity can't hold. Because if I hate me, I hate you. And if I'm sabotaging myself, I'm going to sabotage you. And it's the same way that I feel about the disciplines. Interdisciplinarity is a scam. There's another word now for it, which is even prettier than interdisciplinarity. Transdisciplinary. The buzzwords, you got to know your buzzwords. Those faggot goes like essays, you will... gotta loot. But it's a scam, because it's that kind of reconciliatory work. It's that thing that the structure does, which goes ahead of you and anticipates you, which takes what is your revolutionary language and anticipates it, so that the next time you try June 16 or Fees Must Fall, the structure has gone ahead of you and anticipate. You have zero chance. The best thing you can do with that experience is critique that experience while submerged in it, right? I mean, there's no good reason to doi, but something happens for me when I doi, but while I'm doing, I critique my doing, because I know I'm self-sabotaging. And so solidarity is a thing for me which falls apart. But also the disciplines cannot be in solidarity with me. They can be in solidarity with each other, because their sets of coordinates, their assumptive logic is consistent. But I was never a part of that thing. Politics became politics on the fact of my non-being. Sociality, community, anthropology, history is only history because I don't have one. If I had one, then it would be dubious and we would need evidence the way we need it anytime I say anything, right? So if the disciplines could coalesce with blackness, they wouldn't be disciplines, because absence and presence don't give you a synthesis. Like you have a hobbling, as soon as blackness comes in, you have a hobbling dialectic, because there is no ontological density. Me and you are not darker and lighter versions of each other. You are only you because I am not. You know what I'm saying? And so the disciplines cannot coalesce with blackness, because if they did, they would fail the work of discipline and disciplining. So I don't really have a crisis, and I don't say that like in a flip way. It's taken me a minute to get here, but the only thing that is a matter of doing, if anybody wants to know what to do, it's a matter of like, we have to end the paradigm of possibility. We have to end the paradigm which absents me.
I mean, yeah, I concur.
Okay. This is well. No. I hear you.
Okay, so no, before you continue, because
You're like, I want to ask this now.
No, I don't want to ask this now, and I think people definitely want to ask questions. So what I'm going to do is give a vote of thanks for the people who are still online, and then we're going to close for the people who are online, and then the people who are here. Sorry, friends, maybe we'll catch you next time. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close from the online section, and then we'll have questions from the floor. Then we can have a little bit longer conversation and discussion, because you guys have definitely, wow. I mean, so before I finish, so my name is Brenda Fassie, and I'm part of the team that manages the Forge and the Commune. I think for a lot of people, they don't really understand the work that we do, because we take the intersection of culture and politics seriously, and we acknowledge the importance and the significance of having spaces to have conversations like this in long form. So we're not just a tweet away, but we're actually sitting down and we're talking with each other, and we're kind of figuring out how we're mapping our minds and how we're mapping our lived experience. So thank you, all three of you, for adding to the canon of Black life and being part of Alternative, so that now when you speak, if someone wants to refer to this particular recording, it's possible, right? In a way that wasn't possible when we were writing our own things. Tonight would not have been possible without iwalewabooks. I know Nadine, Katerina, and Koketso of Black Ark are out there. I can't see them from here, but we just want to say thank you so much. And thank you everyone who has come out tonight. Thank you to the team who's done the work. Mwelela, Nonzuzo, Yvonne. And for those of you online, good night. Those of you still here, I hope you're ready for your questions. But I'll let Danai moderate that.
Yes. So